All right, we're opening up the webinar, so we're going to let everybody start signing in here. And once the number kind of plateaus, we'll go ahead and get started with the conference. Nice to see some familiar names signing on here. Some of our past presenters are on today. We got David Benscotter in the audience, and Gail Volk, and Joseph Postman. We really appreciate everyone's contributions to this webinar series. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the February edition of the Heritage Orchard Conference webinar series. This month we have a presentation entitled Preserving Historic Orchards in the National Parks, History and Methods. It should be a really interesting conversation. I'm pretty excited about this one. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please use the Q&A app that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions for the presenters. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Katrina Mendrey from Montana State University, and she'll give our introduction today.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So as Kyle mentioned, I am Katrina and I'm from Montana State University. I'm the Orchard Program Manager at the Western Ag Research Center in Corvallis, Montana, where we also manage a program preserving Montana's historic and heritage orchards across the state. And I came across Susan Dolan's A Fruitful Legacy when I was putting together some resources for our heritage orchard owners on preserving those orchards and researching their history and just a plethora of information in that document. And so I was excited to invite Susan to present as part of this series. Susan is the Bureau Historical Landscape Architect for the National Park Service, which means that she guides the, I think it's 423 park units in preserving cultural landscapes. As I mentioned, she authored A Fruitful Legacy, as well as an additional handbook on fruit tree stabilization. And she will be followed by Fritz, who is the orchard manager at the Capitol Reef National Park, one of my favorite national parks. There's over 1,900 historic trees that have been there since the late 1880s when they were planted by pioneers, including plums, apricots, apples, pears. And he is going to present on their project to restore some of those orchards and also renovate and replace in a way that keeps in mind the historic nature of that place. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Susan. And as mentioned, we're going to hold all questions to the very end after we've heard from both Susan and Fritz. So enjoy. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you, Kyle. It's truly an honor to be here in this group today. Thank you. So our presentation is Preserving Historic Orchards in the National Parks, History and Methods. And as Katrina mentioned, I'm Susan Dolan, the Bureau Historical Landscape Architect, and I'll be followed by my colleague, Fritz Maslan, who is the horticulturist and orchardist at Capitol Reef National Park. So I'm going to be talking about orchard history in the national parks, and specifically the evolution of orchards over time, historic orchards in the national parks, and dating orchards and fruit trees. Some tips and tricks on that. And this is an image of myself and some colleagues in the National Park Service summer pruning a fruit tree in the reconstructed orchard at Fort Vancouver National Historic Site in Washington, where we, about 20 years ago, replanted an orchard to reconstruct the one that the Hudson Bay had there, the Hudson Bay Company, in the 1820s. Why do historic orchards exist in the national parks? And there are 423 national parks, as Katrina mentioned, and we add new ones. We grow the system. The most recent additions came in the 2020s. There are about 1/3 of all national parks have old fruit trees within them, and that's because orchards were very important to life and were planted on lands before those lands became designated as national parks. And myself and my colleagues that work in cultural landscape preservation, we help to determine which of those are historically significant and which historic orchards and fruit trees should be preserved as cultural resources. We preserve orchards and fruit trees as cultural resources to help fulfill the National Park Service mission. The mission of the agency is to preserve and protect cultural and natural resources for the enjoyment of present and future generations. And the National Park Service is actually the lead federal historic preservation agency. And historic orchards and fruit trees are cultural resources. And here we're looking at 3 examples. At the top, we have the Buckner Orchard in North Cascades National Park in Washington, dating to the 1920s. At the bottom, we're seeing the Pecan Orchard at Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park in Texas. And over on the right side, remarkably dating to the 1850s, we have the Curry Apple Orchard in Yosemite Valley in Yosemite National Park. As Katrina mentioned, I was involved with a couple of documents. I had colleagues that helped me with these too, and these are available for free as downloadable PDFs. You could take a screenshot of this slide and use these links later to download these PDFs. Fruitful Legacy is about the history of orchards in America and about how to nominate orchards for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And the one on the right is about how to stabilize the condition of historic orchards and old fruit trees. So before we look at orchard history, we're just going to look at a few concepts that are really key to the evolution of orchards over time. Those concepts are species, variety, rootstock, scion, tree form, and tree spacing. And before we leave this slide, take a look at this map. It's a system of orchards in California at the Jack London State Historic Park that dates from the turn of the 20th century. And in it, the orchards were laid out by species blocks. The apples were laid out distinct from the pears, the plums, the apricots, the cherries, etc. And this is really typical of an orchard where a lot of fruit was being grown for both subsistence and revenue generating purposes. And in this case, this orchard was actually a poor farm that was part of the state hospital system up until about the mid-20th century. So species is the difference between a peach and an apricot and a cherry. This is a taxonomic rank that separates apple from pear, from walnut, from pecan, etc. So species, some orchards were grown with one species of fruit, some were grown with multiple species within them. But something that's important to underscore is that most US orchard species were actually introduced into this country and aren't native plants, with some notable exceptions like pecan and some plums, but most of them were brought from other parts of the world. If we look at varieties, varieties are sort of a subgroup of species, a way to subdivide a species. We're looking here at varieties of apple, Asopus Spitzberg, Yellow Transparent, and Gravenstein, all varieties that were originated in America. And these varieties were originated in the golden age of pomology in the United States. And in this country, in the 19th century, most American varieties of orchard fruits were originated. We're also looking at varieties of pear here. The one in the middle, the Seckel, is one of the earliest American varieties of pear originated. Moving on from species and varieties to rootstock and scion. So the rootstock is the root part, the scion is the aerial canopy or variety part of a fruit tree. Not all fruit trees are composed of a rootstock and scion. Variety trees are always composed of a scion and a rootstock. And that's because humans discovered thousands of years ago, actually in ancient China, that it was necessary to reproduce a variety vegetatively rather than through seed in order that it would be perpetuated over time. And it was easier to make that tissue of the variety meld with the roots of another plant than create its own roots. And so grafting was invented to graft a variety to the roots of another plant in order to propagate the variety. And we have a scion joined to a rootstock via a graft union. And today, most fruit trees in orchards are grafted, but that wasn't the case several hundred years ago. And this is what the graft union looks like in new trees and older trees. We can sometimes discern the graft union. Sometimes it's not visible to the eye. Sometimes it might be beneath the ground. Grafting is done by various means. In fact, in this conference series, we've had other presentations on how to graft. This is a couple of examples of how to graft, whip grafting versus bud grafting. But in each case, two individuals are being joined together and their tissues melded in a graft union. So I mentioned that trees in the United States orchards haven't always been grafted variety trees. In fact, in the first couple hundred years that fruit trees were being brought to this country, they were brought as seeds, and trees were grown from seed in the orchard, giving rise to one whole tree on its own roots, and a very long-lived individual it was in that form. But from the 19th century onwards, the use of varieties became important, much, much more important, and therefore grafting was necessary to propagate varieties, and we have grafted trees, two individuals put together. And in the 19th century, the rootstocks were seedling rootstocks. So essentially the similar roots to the roots of the seedling tree, just with a variety grafted to them. We also see tree spacing in the orchard evolve considerably over time, going from irregular spacing, lacking geometry in the earliest orchards, those ones that were started out from seed, lacked regular geometry, to regular spacing, and really going from full-size trees with a regular geometry in a relatively tight spacing to opening up to a bigger spacing by the early 20th century, to the use of dwarfing trees, dwarfing rootstocks that we see today that are very tightly planted in extremely dense spacing. So really quite an evolution of tree spacing over time. So delving into history, in the earliest period, as I mentioned, 1600 to 1800, trees were brought to the United States for orchards as seeds and planted out as seeds. The trees grew up as seedling trees with a sort of a wild character, crooked and thorny and lots of spurs, giving rise to sort of thickets, canopies that were thickets. They lacked regular geometry, and the trees had very tall trunks because the livestock and the wildlife roused those lower limbs off the trees, limbing up the canopies to give these tall trunks. The fruits weren't necessarily good to eat raw, but the fruits were great for baking, for drying, and for feeding livestock. In the national parks, we have very, very few fruit trees that date to this period. Here's just a couple of examples. At Minuteman National Historical Park in Massachusetts, we have these seedling apple trees that are more than 250 years old. We're preserving them in a landscape that is depicting the time of the Revolutionary War from the 1770s, 1780s. And you can see their massively tall trunks, enormous stature, but their sort of wild habit. And here in Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area in New Jersey, on the Dingman's farm, a historic farmstead, we have a number of seedling apple trees that are also more than 250 years old. And here you're seeing some pretty severe pruning work being done on these trees to remove the dead wood. But since these photos were taken, the trees have been reinvigorated and propagated, and the orchard itself restored. So it's a lot of great work has been done here at Delaware Water Gap. And another example of this period is the old apple tree at Fort Vancouver. And those of us on the West Coast are quite familiar with this tree. It was planted from seed in the 1820s, so one tree on its own roots. It survived right up until the 2020 when a windstorm blew it over. But it has root suckers coming up, of which one or more are going to be trained and preserved and protected and will eventually replace the old tree, and it will be the exact same tree, effectively a clone of the genes of the tree. Moving on to the next period in the evolution of orchards, we see the creation of orchard society, horticultural societies, horticultural journalism emerging in the early 1800s, along with commercial nurseries, and therefore the emphasis on varieties as being the orchard trees that produce fruit that is excellent to eat raw rather than being cooked. And therefore the emphasis on varieties and grafting young trees that will be planted out rather than sown. And what goes along with this is regular spacing. We see a regular grid pattern in the orchards. We see relatively tight spacing for the size of these trees. These trees are grafted onto seedling rootstocks, and that gives rise to these full-size, massive trees, and they actually tended to be planted fairly close considering the full mature size of these trees. The wildlife and the livestock still did a great job of limbing up these trunks, and so we had still very, very tall trunks. And we see this incredible abundance of varieties that are originated in this time, the golden age of pomology. In the national parks, we have some examples of orchards that date to this period of time, the 1800s. And we see an example at Adams National Historical Park in Massachusetts, where we preserve the home and the grounds of President John Adams in the late 1700s and his son, another president, John Quincy Adams, in the early 1800s. And this Baldwin apple tree it has a very tall trunk and dates to the 19th century. Another example is in the Curry Orchard in Yosemite Valley I mentioned before, dating to the 1850s, where a homesteader planted an orchard, a series of orchards in fact, with many varieties of apple. And this is because he wanted to have choice to sell to travelers, tourists to the area and other homesteaders. So he planted a range of many varieties. And you can see what tall trunks and actually regular spacing, but relatively tight spacing, these extremely large trees have. Another example of trees from this period is at the orchard at San Juan Island National Historical Park, where the very first homesteader here in the 1880s planted a pear orchard that remains today Each tree is a different variety, and trees have extremely large trunks, regular spacing, but relatively tight for the size of the trees. In the 1870s, the US Department of Agriculture was formed, and it really ushered in a great change in the appearance of orchards. It led to the professionalization of farmers as orchardists, and it was responsible for a tremendous amount of knowledge, training, was published, disseminated across the country. The huge innovation that happened at this time was low heading of trees, low heading of tree trunks. So this is to shorten the trunk of the tree and bring the whole canopy closer to the ground for easier access. And this is done when the tree is extremely young and a whip is cut off 18 inches to 3 feet above the ground, and those lateral buds allowed to grow out and form the scaffold branches on a short trunk. And the idea, of course, was to try and control the size of these trees, which were still being grafted onto seedling rootstocks at this time. And a great concern was control of pests and diseases and being able to spray the trees, as well as pruning them. By this time, pruning becomes important. It was not important in the 19th century or earlier, but by the early 20th century, pruning becomes the norm. Also, we start to see a great rationalization in the number of varieties that are available in nurseries and are planted in orchards. There was the consideration of commercial characteristics, and all of those varieties, those thousands that were originated in the 19th century, they didn't all have good keeping qualities, transportability qualities, etc. And so those that had the most fitness for commercial production were those that became more widely available in the 20th century. And we see a huge reduction in the number of varieties grown. In this period, 1880s to the time of the Second World War, as I mentioned, we see pruning, and we start to see pruning styles adopted. So we see central leader trees, open bowl trees, modified central leader pruning styles, all of them being used on these low-headed, short trunk trees. An example in the National Park System of an orchard from this period of time is the remarkable Buckner Orchard in Stehekin in North Cascades National Park in Washington, where the orchard dates back to the 1920s. The trees are all low-headed with these short trunks, and actually just a very few number of varieties are grown, and those were ones that were commercially viable by this time, including the Rome Beauty, which became very important in Washington State, and also an early iteration of Red Delicious known as the Common Delicious. Another example of this period in Fritz's neck of the woods, this is an orchard that Fritz takes care of. He'll tell you more about in a minute. This is the Mulford Orchard in Capitol Reef National Park in Utah. It's an apricot orchard from the 1920s, and we see this beautifully consistent low heading or short trunk trees throughout. So tree form being really archetypal of this period. After the Second World War, orchards come in under the influence of the global economy and the global influence of technology. And the United States inherits and adopts technology that other countries were already using in orchards. Perhaps most importantly, the use of dwarfing rootstocks, clonal dwarfing rootstocks. And as a result, we see tree spacing become tighter and tighter. And we also see, of course, dwarf trees, but we see the continuation of reduction in number of varieties available right up until about the 1980s. By the 1980s, 1 of every 2 apples grown commercially in the United States was a Red Delicious, but consumer demand for more choice really pressured a revolution to occur. And since the 1980s, we're seeing new varieties, old heirloom varieties rekindled, and just a great deal more choice than there was 20, 30 years ago. So more abundance of varieties today than there was at a low point in the 1980s. We didn't immediately go from seedling rootstock standard trees to dwarf trees. We sort of stepped down between the Second World War and the present day from semi-standard to semi-dwarf to dwarf trees. And that's because technology, equipment needed to become smaller in order to be able to make use of the dwarf trees that needed to be spaced close together to get the same amount of yield out of the same size piece of land. So it was necessary to graduate down. As an example here, we're seeing semi-standard trees at Capitol Reef. And when I took this photograph, these trees were already about 40 years old, but they look young, and that's because they're on a rootstock that will always reduce their vigor and make them more miniaturized than full-size trees on seedling rootstocks. An example of how this applied to pears. This is semi-dwarfed pear trees in the beautiful Hood River Valley of Oregon near Mount Hood. And in this period, we see dwarfing rootstocks developed for most orchard species. So that's how orchard fruits are generally grown today on dwarf trees, dwarf rootstocks. And we see the use of the most dwarfing rootstocks that lead to trees that need to be supported their whole lives within the last 30 years. Example of trellising systems and the way new orchards, commercial orchards, are planted today. Just a snapshot in time, this Cosmic Crisp orchard was planted in 2018. It's planted with the trees 5 feet apart. These are obviously on dwarfing rootstocks. And at this spacing, we have about 500 trees per acre. Compare that with the Buckner Orchard at North Cascades, where the trees in the 1920s were planted at 30 feet apart at just 40 trees per acre. So today, we see orchards with a high density of 500, 1,000, 2,000 trees per acre. And those trees that whole orchard is an entirely different experience to the one where we have trees at 30 feet apart, canopies overhead. So just a really quick recap. In the earliest period, we had seedling trees. They were ungrafted. The orchards had no regular geometry. By the 19th century, we see the adoption of variety trees that are grafted still onto seedling rootstocks, so full-size trees, geometric, regular geometry, relatively tight spacing for the size of the trees. By the time of the advent of the USDA in the 1870s, and after that, the Second World War, we see the innovation of the low-headed tree, the short trunk, and pruning styles. We see a relatively wider spacing, regular geometry. And then since the Second World War, we've seen the adoption of dwarfing rootstocks, orchards getting more dwarf through the decades since the Second World War, and the use of tighter and tighter spacing. So orchards have changed a great deal. Let's just think for a moment about longevity of orchards and longevity of fruit trees, and this is variable by species. A peach tree has a lot less longevity than an apple tree. And the longevity of an olive or a fig, I think, is untested, unknown. These can live for thousands of years, these species. But as a note, the shorter longevity of peach, cherry, plum means they may be missing from an old orchard, but don't assume that they weren't there historically. If you encounter an old orchard, it has trees missing, has gaps in the geometry, it could be that those were those shorter lived species that have since died, and all we have left today are the apples and the pear. And also a note about tree form and longevity. Trees that are on their own roots, seedling trees, have greater longevity than grafted trees. Trees that are grafted to seedling rootstocks have greater longevity than dwarfing rootstocks. And one of the key objectives of using dwarfing rootstocks was to cause the fruit trees to fruit sooner in their lives. and as a result sort of speed up the life cycle and also speed up their mortality. So when a fruit tree is on a dwarfing rootstock, it can fruit perhaps in its second year of life as opposed to its 12th year of life on a seedling rootstock, but it means its whole life cycle will be brought forward and it will not be as long-lived as a tree on a seedling rootstock. In terms of being an orchard detective, I want to encourage anyone that's concerned with dating orchards, dating fruit trees, to try to understand the broader geographic and historic context of an orchard or the fruit tree. So do some research and get to know that place and what transpired there, what the environment was like historically, who lived there, how the land was used. All of these things help to frame your understanding of the orchard of fruit trees. And in the field, take a look at the overall orchard, the overall regularity or not of the tree spacing, and look at the overall regularity or irregularity of the tree form. Do the trees have tall trunks or are they low-headed? Here we're looking at an olive orchard, historic orchard, olive orchard in Channel Islands National Park in California. And when we go inside the orchard, notice whether there are multiple species or one species and maybe one variety or many varieties. Many species, many varieties will tend to suggest that this is more of a homestead orchard or more sort of for local consumption. And one variety will tend to indicate that this is a commercial orchard and probably more recent, probably post-19th century. And how well is the scaffold form of the limbs formed? This tells us something about the level of professionalization, where the person was a novice that was growing these trees. And be cautious in using the diameter of the tree trunk as a metric for age. And that's because the same age trees of the same species, but different varieties, can have different diameters that be the same age. So a Comex pear tree will have a much larger diameter than a Bartlett pear tree, even if the trees are the same age, because Comex is just naturally much larger variety. So be cautious with that. And don't assume that the form of the tree is somehow just natural. Don't assume that these olive trees here are adopting a natural form. They were actually artificially interacted with to control their shape and have low-headed, short-trunk trees, as opposed to this 300-year-old olive tree in Andalusia in Spain, which was formed with a tall trunk. So we're looking at, on the left side, we're looking at pear trees. And as I approach this orchard, I understand that it has regular spacing, has relatively tight spacing for the size of these trees. They're obviously full-size trees on seedling rootstocks. They have taller trunks and there's some irregularity between them. And that's telling me this is probably not a 20th century orchard. When I look at the trees on the right, I can see this orchard has wide spacing, regular geometry. It has low-headed trees with short trunks. This is also a pear orchard. And I don't rely just on those things. I also rely on research to understand that, in fact, the trees on the left date from the late 1800s and the trees on the right date from the 1920s, but it's consistent with what we know about orchard history. And another note about low-headed trees, actually just flick back to this one for a second and look how sometimes you think, well, is this a low-headed tree? Is this a tree that was just allowed to develop a short trunk without any kind of deliberate intervention? And sometimes it can be hard to tell, but let me leave you with this idea that when a tree is deliberately low-headed, like these pear trees here at the Jack London orchard, the scaffold limbs are almost the same age as the trunk. They are extremely stout and they were deliberately formed on that trunk in that set position of this open bowl form. In this orchard, it was so overgrown, it wasn't possible to actually even sight between one tree and the next to understand tree spacing, geometry, etc. So in this case, it was actually necessary to GPS each tree and map them in order to discern the pattern of the geometry. So sometimes this is necessary. I'm going to wrap up here with leaving you these thoughts. Things that we can learn from historic orchards. How people used to live and how the land was used. This is really important to me. I'm as interested in the orchard as a whole landscape that is an imprint of culture as I am in a single heirloom variety that lives within it. I'm interested in the system and protecting it. The orchard can also tell us something about the cultural heritage of growers in the choices that they made in terms of layout, in terms of the species and varieties that they chose to grow. These things can be variable by cultural tradition. Historic orchards also tell us how horticultural practices changed over time, how pruning wasn't important before the 19th century and became so important in the early 20th century. Orchards can also tell us how the fertility of land has changed over time. It can tell us that at a certain point in time, this land supported the growing of orchards. And perhaps the environmental conditions have changed a great deal since then. So that it can be a window into the fertility of conditions at a particular point in time. It also is indicative of the species and varieties that are resilient in a particular locale. If I have a few species and varieties remaining in an orchard that's been neglected or abandoned for a period of decades, it tells me something about the resilience of those species and varieties in that place. And it's something we're going to want to be mindful of if we're thinking about adding more trees and restoring an orchard in the future, is to look at what is resilient in that place and propagate those. So I want to thank you, ask you to contact me at Susan_Dolan at mps.gov if you have any questions. And I'm delighted to now pass on to my colleague, Fritz Maslan. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And just a reminder to everybody, I do see that there are some questions in the chat for Susan, but we'll be asking those at the end. All right, thank you, and take it away, Fritz.
Great, thank you, Susan. Thanks, Katrina. So yeah, my name is Fritz Maslan, as folks have said, and I'm the horticulturist here at Capitol Reef National Park. And I'm going to talk a little bit about taking a closer look at using some of the concepts that Susan was just discussing to actively manage a historic orchard, which is generally what my job entails. The title here, Why Are Fruit Trees Here, is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but this is a pretty common question that I get. Why are we growing fruit trees in a national park in a high desert Colorado plateau environment with red rocks and very little precipitation throughout the year? So Utah generally has the state has a large history with fruit cultivation, and this park this area was first had people plant fruit trees here in the 1880s when Mormon pioneers got to Capitol Reef, the area which is sort of the central part of the park called Fruta. This photo here is hopefully, I'm not sure if I actually started screen sharing, so sorry if I'm just jumping in here without doing that. There we go. So now you can actually see the photos. But this is one of our peach orchards, the Carroll Orchard here in Capitol Reef National Park. So we're surrounded by these tall red rock cliffs.
Fritz, I don't know that we can see it yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you still having trouble?
Try.
Oops. Is it working now?
Yes, there you go.
All right, there we go.
All right, thank you.
So anyways, there's that photo there. And this is generally what I wake up to every day. So this is a very unique area to be growing in, and as a microclimate that I'll touch on later on, that's contained within the red rock walls here. And I'll start just discussing the sort of historical significance of fruta in the orchards here. I'll talk a little bit about the diversity of fruits that we have here in the orchards, and how that ties into Susan's discussion of the different periods of fruit diversification throughout the United States. I'll talk a bit about the conditions that we have here at the park that we're working on improving, and some of our replanting efforts that we're jumping into in the next year or two. So this is just a quick map that shows the layout of Fruta here. We're situated along two water courses. So this Sulphur Creek runs along Highway 24 and then has a confluence with the Fremont River, which is that second band of river that you can see running along the southern portion of the map. And so these provide our irrigation water for us, and the orchards are generally laid out right along the rivers as they were originally put down in the 1880s when the pioneers arrived here. We've got about 60% in agricultural use, which primarily means orchards, and then another 40% or so in field crops. And being that we are on the National Register of Historic Places, that's a ratio that we are interested in preserving, as that's the historic land use pattern in this area. But obviously that does change a little bit as we are replanting orchards and as trees are dying off and orchards are being transitioned to fields. And as Susan was mentioning, there's these multiple periods of history within fruit production in the United States, and the first period of significance that we see in our orchard is generally what would be called the second period within Susan's designations there. So the first fruit trees, as I mentioned, were planted in the 1880s, and this period of fruit production in Fruta is generally going to last until the 1920s. This was a time period when you had several families with different homesteads growing a wide variety of fruit for their personal consumption, primarily here in the park. And so here's a photo of Tyne Euler, one of the historic folks who was here, who still has family in the area, tending his apple trees. As you can see, they're quite unruly, and so the pruning wasn't as intensive as it is today. And some early Fruta residents there on the right, and in the background, I'll just point your attention to the regular spacing, which is generally found within Fruta since the beginning of fruit production here. But these were, as I mentioned, generally mixed plantings, and so they weren't typically for commercial production, but they were more to have supply a family with fruit throughout the year. And as we move into past the 1920s into the 30s and 40s and up until the 1960s, Fruta became more representative of the third period of significance in United States fruit production. At this point, after the 1920s, roads became more accessible into the area and vehicles became more prevalent here. And so fruit was able to be transported much longer distances. So commercial peach and cherry production really took over. As I mentioned earlier, there's a microclimate here at the park. So the fact that we have a confluence of different rivers coming in in the valley, as well as these tall red rock cliffs surrounding it, provide warmer temperatures year round and significantly more growing days than we have even in neighboring parts of the county. So this was an area where peaches and cherries could be grown much more effectively than most of the surrounding part of the state, and that's where the cash crop was. So these fruits were being transported as far away as Nebraska, and at this point we transitioned to a more regular orchard layout with less of the mixed fruit varieties, but more you would have a block planting, say, of peaches or cherries that would be commercially produced. And some overview photos here, you can see that those more exemplary photos of that later period of significance, where there are single blocks. So on the right side photo, there's single blocks of apricots on in the background, and then peaches in the foreground, which have since been removed. And the spacing also varied quite a bit depending on tree type. So Fruta was interesting in the fact that it was quite isolated from the rest of the world, so or the rest of the country, and so didn't follow those trends in fruit and orchard development throughout time quite as closely as other orchards did. But we do see the low-headed fruit trees typically planted onto seedling rootstock, full-size rootstock, and those are things that we are preserving in the landscape today. Just a note on kind of the modern relevance of the orchards here. We still do operate these orchards on a U-pick fruit system, so visitors can come and pick fruit themselves, as you see in that center picture. And why do we value these orchards? I think this provides a learning experience for everyone. One thing that I often hear from folks picking in the orchards is that they really, either them or their children have never actually picked fruit from a tree before. So it's a unique experience for people to be able to learn about the heritage of orchards in the United States, how fruit used to be grown versus how it is today, and what things look like before there may have been easy access in supermarkets. So this is a real cultural significance both to the local area, which has a lot of surviving family members of these original pioneers existing still here in the county, as well as outside visitors who have not had a chance to really come and experience fruit. So that's a unique part of our park that you don't see everywhere else. And then again, here's a photo of Ty Euler enjoying his fruit trees. Currently here at the park, we have just under 1,900 fruit trees. This number fluctuates every year depending on how you count, but generally we have somewhere around the 1,800 mark, and we're looking to increase that to around 2,500 over the next 10 years with our replanting efforts, and that would bring it back to a more historically accurate number of fruit trees here in Fruita. We have 12 species of fruit growing here at the park currently. That's primarily focused on, the majority of that fruit is in apples, apricots, peaches, and pears in that order. And then we also have some cherry trees as well. But one thing that I'll touch on in a minute is how those ratios of fruit have changed over time. In the past, far more peaches and cherries were being grown here, whereas now we're a lot heavier on apples. So that's another condition that we are looking on changing. But we have 65 varieties in total, and about 48 of those are what we would consider heirloom varieties. So most of the varieties in Fruita are fruit that is not being grown commercially in other locations. There are some exceptions to that, but one really unique thing that we preserve here in the Fruita orchards are these rarer or more unique varieties that aren't being grown in a commercial setting, as Susan had touched on. One thing that I think is really important to a historic landscape is what were the previous conditions. And like I just talked about, in the past, we know that far more peaches were being grown and cherries were being grown here in the park, as opposed to more apricots and apples that are being grown currently. So as you can see in this graph here, in 1970, there was a much higher concentration of peaches and apple trees, or peaches and apricot trees when compared to apples and pears. But as we move into the 2005-2021 condition assessments that were done, we find that ratio has really decreased, and that apples have become more prevalent. So that's something that with our replanting, we're currently focused on replanting stone fruits to bring the orchards more in line with the historical conditions that were found here. And part of that is also just as Susan touched on, a product of the shorter lifespan of stone fruits, or of specifically peaches. In this case, they will only survive 30 to 40 years, whereas apple trees can go well over 100 years. So naturally, you have increased die-off of things like peaches and cherry trees. So those need to be replanted more often. And unfortunately, there's been no successful replanting in Capitol Reef for about the last 30, 35 years. So that's something that is sort of just a natural progression that happens and needs to be focused on when we're rehabilitating these areas. So that's a little bit of the history and our current situation that we have here at the park. And I want to from here touch on some of the data collection that we've worked into our orchard operations that's helped us to understand the orchards better and the conditions that we have here in Capitol Reef. And then talk a little bit about our different management challenges and how we're managing those going forward. So in 2020, we did a comprehensive condition assessment, went to every single tree and took data points on a whole list of factors, which we then boiled down to these basically a total condition for each individual tree. And what you're looking at is basically the overall product of those condition assessments. So this is something that I guess I would highly recommend any orchardist to do, especially if you're working with historic orchards or maybe an orchard that is new to you. This has given us a really good window into exactly how our trees are behaving and where they are in terms of their condition. So we do these about every 5 years. We do a comprehensive condition assessment. So we'll do another one in 2025. And then every year in between that, we'll do a smaller sampling of the trees. But what I want to point out here is that we really were able to determine some of our trends in the orchard through this process. So if you look at the Jackson orchard that's in the upper left portion of that map, you can see a trend with the southern part of the orchard being in better condition than the northern part. And you'll see the same thing with the Abbey Clark orchard just to the right of that. This really just translates into us being able to know where we need to put our focus in terms of where we are pruning, where we are doing fertilization, and that's those sorts of things. And it's been a really big, really useful for us, even though we are not a commercial operation and we don't use nearly as much data collection or scientific methods as a commercial operation may. This has been really useful for us. And then one other thing that we changed was moving this to an entirely electronic system. If anyone's interested in talking about this more, I won't touch too much more on it in this presentation, but we use Survey 123 combined with a GIS database to do this all on tablets, all digital, and have all of our data streamed directly into a GIS database. So that really cut down on the data collection for us, and I think was a really useful tool that could be used in a wide variety of orchards for future condition assessments. We do have orchards that are in decline here at the park. We have, as I mentioned, a lot of peach trees that have died off in the last 30 to 35 years. And we still do have on the order of 400 peach trees here at the park, but they are generally at the end of their lifespans are in severe decline. So that is sort of our first target for replanting these orchards, is to rehabilitate our peach and cherry crops. And then from there, we'll move on to preserving some of our more unique fruit trees. But there's really a trifecta of things that have been affecting these trees. As you can see on the photos, there's quite a bit of sun scald on the lower photo there. That's something that we deal with pretty consistently throughout our orchards here. Being in an arid, high altitude environment, we get a lot of sun damage onto our trees. Another factor that is we're fighting right now is our age and our disease. We don't have too many endemic diseases here. We've been able to avoid fire blight for the most part. We do have codling moth and peach twig borer, but they don't cause huge problems for us. But again, one of the major factors that is affecting the decline of the fruta orchards right now is the age of the trees. Most trees are at the end of their lifespans and need to be replanted. I think it's a really unique thing that Susan touched on a little bit, is that, fruit trees and fruit orchards are a living landscape. And so while we may want to preserve things as much as we can, some of the examples that Susan gave of 250, 300-year-old trees, we also need to acknowledge that fruit trees will die, and especially the shorter lived ones. And so we need to be replanting those fruit trees in a way that is consistent with the historic landscape. And that's a lot of what my job is focused on. How do we replant these trees in a way that is consistent and still preserves the feel and the qualities of that historic landscape as they would have existed 100 years ago. And I'll touch a little bit more on how we balance that when I talk about the actual replanting that we're doing. But to just continue with this sort of triangle we have going on, another issue that we've identified is severely depleted soils here in fruta. So fertilization has been a big focus over the last several years and will continue to be, to try to rejuvenate those soils and bring organic matter and nutrient levels up. And as far as irrigation goes, we water our orchards on a combination of flood and furrow irrigation. So this is typically done by, we have buried pipe that runs to the head of each orchard and then is kicked out into open flood ditches From there, it's moved manually with metal dams by our team members throughout the orchards and is pushed into furrows, which then move that water throughout the orchard down through the rows of trees, and then it's catched and returned to the Fremont or Sulphur Creek. This is a historic practice that we are really interested in preserving. It's not something that is seen in very many orchards these days. It definitely has a long history of practice in Utah, but also has been phased out in most commercial farming operations. And this is something that, again, is very tied to our commercial or our historic practices here in Fruita. So a lot of these ditches that are being used currently, and some of the ones in these photos may have been original ditches that were repurposed when the park took over ownership of this area. And this provides really good saturation for the most part, and we can control it quite well to where we want it to go. But we do find that, you know, this is just a much more can be a more hands-on operation in terms of irrigation, where something like drip irrigation may take less maintenance in some ways. This is definitely very hands-on, but does provide us a very good way of irrigating. And one thing that we are paying attention to is also climate change, and that the fact that we may have to change this irrigation in the future, but trying to find ways of retaining this flood furrow irrigation into the future as best we can. So that's things like selecting for rootstocks that are tolerant to drought, mulching around the bases of our trees to have better moisture retention through the hot season. So we are hoping that this is something that we can maintain going forward. But again, climate change, of course, is a consideration. So right now what we're doing is trying to get a good sense of soil moisture and how our water is moving throughout our soil column as we water and as we go through the season. We typically water about every 2 weeks. We'll water an orchard, and they'll just be on a rotation where we're watering 4 to 6 orchards every day. So it is quite intensive. As Susan mentioned, nearly all of our fruit trees here in Capitol Reef are pruned to a open center or a vase. And they are low-headed. So on the left is a great example of that. We've got about 6 primary scaffolds coming out of a low-headed trunk that's about 3 feet off the ground. This is the historical method of pruning that was found in Fruita, and that was done here from the 1880s when those fruit trees were first planted, all the way up until the park took ownership of the orchards, and that has been continued ever since. While, as I touched on earlier, you know, Fruita may not have been 100% in line with those individual periods of orchard history, but did sort of pull from multiple different aspects of those different time periods. So we do have a few trees that are modified central leader. Some of our older trees and some of our pear trees that typically grow very vertical have been pruned to modified central leader, but primarily it is an open vase shape. We prune every year. We have seasonal employees come in and prune in the winter times. So we're running a crew right now. We have 3 people out there, plus myself, and we are able to get through somewhere around 600 to 800 trees a year, depending on what we're pruning. But each tree gets pruned on about a 2 to 3 year rotation is our goal. And I'll move into the regeneration and the replanting here. I've kind of been dancing around it for this entire presentation, but really our main focus in the next couple of years is trying to replant the orchards. That continual replanting is something that needs to happen for us to maintain our numbers of fruit trees and preserve this landscape the way it needs to be done. So what we're going to be doing in the spring of this year, which I am really excited about, is going to be planting 260 peach trees in the Cook Orchard. I'll show a map in a second of where exactly that's at, but this will continue for about the next 10 years until we're planted back up to where we need to be. In the past, over the last 30 years, plantings have been attempted here in Fruita, but have failed for a variety of reasons, whether that was the preparation of the planting holes, irrigation issues, or even trees being shipped with disease from nurseries. Only about 10% of the trees that were attempted to be established over the last 35 years have survived, and most of those are stunted. So we're really taking a step back right now and trying to reevaluate our planting procedures. We are hoping that with very careful irrigation, increased fertilization, and with better planting procedures that will be able to overcome some of those issues we've had with replanting in the past. But again, our goal is really to return to around 2,500 trees from the 1,800 that we currently have now. We've identified that as what we think is the most appropriate number given the historical conditions in this area. So these are the 2 orchards that are up for replanting at the very beginning. Tying national park funding to these projects has been difficult just because these are living areas that have to be regraded for irrigation purposes and then replanted over several years. Has been a challenge, but we're finally at the point where we've gotten these orchards field prepped, and we'll be in the next month planting out these peach trees and getting them ready for the spring growing season. And we're hopeful that this will go well. So these 2 orchards, the Guy Smith and the Cook along Highway 24, are the 2 that have been flagged for replanting initially. I'll just show some quick photos here that show the historical conditions versus today's. In 1988, some aerial photos were taken. This is the Guy Smith orchard, which was farmed for a few years, about 30 years ago, and then has been laying fallow ever since. And in 1988, the right-hand side of that photo where the even lines of fruit trees can be seen, that was all peach trees that were planted out. And on the left side photo in 2020, that is that same orchard space, which has no trees remaining. So this orchard has laid fallow for about 30 years. And we hope that will mitigate any orchard replanting issues. And the other orchard, the Cook orchard, which is going to be planted in 2023, we'll only be planting in the Guy Smith in this year, 2022. But in this orchard was also completely full in 1988 and has since been, has lost most of its fruit trees. So in 1988, you can see the center of the orchard was basically full of cherry trees. And on the left side of that photo was a grouping of peach trees. And in 2020, just 30 years later, we've had most of the center of that orchard. All of those cherry trees have declined due to old age and disease and have been removed, as well as most of the peach and apple trees that were there as well. So these both are relatively open orchard planting spaces, and that kind of comes back to that ratio of open field to fruit orchards. So for the next couple of years, we will have more space into fruit orchards, but other older orchards will be transitioned out and trees will be removed there as they die. And so that ratio should return to about that 60-40 split. Our current plan for replanting, which is still a work in progress and will be updated as we go along and learn things from this current round, is to initially rip and grade, remove topsoil, grade the subgrade. Both of these orchards had significant challenges in irrigation. We weren't really able to run our flood-free irrigation over each of these orchards, so we are going to be regrading them to allow irrigation to be run more effectively. After that, we'll spread and till organic matter, till all of that in, so that primarily comes in the form of manure, cured manure, as well as slow release natural fertilizers like feather meal and bone meal that we've been using. And finally, what's coming this spring is the cover crop and replant. So right now we have contractors working on our fields to grade them out. Once that happens, we will go in and prep our tree planting holes and replant with a cover crop directly after we put the peach trees back in. And this will, in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, as long as things go well, provide sort of rejuvenate our peach harvest and replace the trees that are getting to the end of their lifespan, and hopefully help to rehabilitate our orchards and as we go forward. So we'll plant another 250 trees in 2023, and then after that slow down and move to planting around 100 trees every year for the next 5 to 10 years. And depending on how well those trees take, that will put us where we need to be. And then from there we can do slow rehabilitation plantings as needed. I'll talk a little bit just briefly before I finish up here about the varieties that we're using. So as Susan mentioned, and I mentioned a little bit, there are a lot of heirloom or rare varieties being grown in Fruta We have an apple here called the Capital Reef Red that was actually found, the seedling was found here in the park and propagated further. We also have a number of rare apple and other varieties of fruit. So that's something that we want to preserve and sort of also want to provide an opportunity to preserve not just fruit trees that were grown here, but also varieties that were grown in other places, especially if they're relevant to the Intermountain West in the region that we are. We'd really like Fruta to become a repository for those rare fruit varieties. So if there's anything that needs a home, needs a place to be propagated and have a few trees grown out to ensure the survival of that variety, that's something that we'd certainly be interested in working with folks on. We're working on bringing back some of our peach and cherry varieties as well that were known to have been grown here in the park, but have since disappeared. So that's going to be our first focus, is to shore up our peach crop. After that, our focus will be to take cuttings and propagate from our rare and heirloom trees that exist here in the park currently. And then the sort of third step will be to then open it up into a wider range of varieties that are important to the legacy of fruit production here in the United States. And finally, before I go, I'll just mention some of our sort of primary focuses and things that we're looking at for the future. Certainly with a historic landscape that's this involved and has this many different factors, we need a strong plan for how to go about preserving the orchards in a way that is consistent with the historic landscape and with all of the regulations and laws that are in place preserving those landscapes. So we are currently working on an orchard management plan, and we'll be working that through this summer to get that compliance done and get that plan finalized, but that will help to guide our planting over the next 5 to 10 years and provide for a lot of our other management practices as we go forward. Our other big focus is obviously the rejuvenation and the planting of the orchards and providing space for Fruta to act as a rare tree repository in the future. Interpretation is another key thing that we focus on here in the National Park Service. Communicating these orchards to people and the history and the importance of them is something that we are focused on improving with more signage, more interactive ranger programs, and bringing in more people from the surrounding community to experience the fruit trees. Fertilization of our existing soils and adjusting to things like climate change and preparing the orchards to be able to continue to be grown even with a changing climate in the future. So those are some of the things that we're focused on here. And I'm happy to speak with anybody else about any of the specifics. We've got a lot of irons in the fire and a lot of things that we're working on right now here. So I've touched on them all, hopefully a little bit, but I'm happy to get more in depth with anyone if anyone is interested. I will put my email in the chat. I didn't have it on this presentation, but thank you all very much. It's an honor to present to you and to a group that's maybe wider than my typical NPS cohort of orchard folks. So I'm really excited to be here, and thanks to everyone for coming along. Turn it back to you, Katrina. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Fritz. Just a reminder to everyone to put your chat or your questions in the Q&A so that we can keep the chat for other things. And I know where to look for them. But there's quite a few questions for both Susan and Fritz. I'm going to go ahead and start with Susan. Susan, do you... Hold on, I have to get up to Susan's questions. We have a series of questions about the history of bittersweet apples planted in the US. And is there any evidence that bittersweet apples for the purpose of hard cider were planted in any great numbers in the US by immigrants instead of just natural sharp seedlings? I think this person's getting to the idea that we did a lot of planting of seedlings and a lot of those turned out to be sharper than bittersweet, but there were a lot of bittersweet apples available during that time out of France and England. Do you have any thoughts on the history there?
I'm sorry, I can't speak directly to bittersweet apples, but many of the seedling apples that were grown in the earliest period between the 1600s and the 1800s were grown for cider production because potable water wasn't available to everyone, and cider, hard cider, was a beverage that everyone drank. And there was an understanding that these seedling fruit trees provided a wonderful blend of flavors for cider. So they had great fitness for producing cider. And I think that there was more of a reliance on domestically grown seedling apple trees for cider than imported varieties for cider. Yes, sorry, that's probably all.
Great. Yeah, and we did address this topic in some of our previous webinars, which I'll try to link up here in a moment. But the follow-up to that question is, do you know of any bittersweet apples growing in any National Park Service orchards?
Not currently, no, but it is evolving. Our knowledge evolves every year. We are learning more about what we have. Thank you.
Great. And then, do you have any insights into some of the stories around the FBI removing orchards during Prohibition, and specifically bittersweet cider apple orchards? And I think let's see here. The crux of the question is, as a result, over on the East Coast, many existing bittersweet apples were lost. However, I have never been able to find any truth or evidence to this. I am leaning toward it being an urban myth. Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
I'm afraid I can't speak directly to the FBI operating on federal lands, for example, or outside of federal lands in the United States to destroy orchards that were for cider production. But it is well established in period textbooks on orchard growing that orchards were destroyed during the Prohibition era. There was a tremendous impact on the reduction of orchards because of destruction during Prohibition. And in fact, some of the oldest cider orchards that still remain from that period of time are in very discrete locations that are hard to see, that are less visible, harder to discover and encounter because of their potential for being destroyed during the Prohibition era. So it is a very interesting subject, but I don't know a great deal about it.
Great. All right, how about a map or list of the existing orchards and national parks?
Alrighty, well, one thing I can do with the Fruitful Legacy book, if you turn to the appendices, there is a list in the back of all of the national parks that have orchards or fruit trees more than 50 years old. And aside from that, so go ahead and download that PDF. You can also write to me and ask for a hard copy of the document if you'd like it. We are building a website currently which will display all of these orchards in the national park system. And one other thing is the National Parks and Conservation Association, its winter edition of National Parks magazine, put together a really nice article on orchards in the national parks, and even created a very nice little map. So that's the current NPCA National Parks magazine. So look for a website in the future, but in the meantime, look at the back of Fruitful Legacy.
Great, thank you. And last question, could you talk at all about the need to preserve historical fruit trees outside of the national park system, just within our everyday private lands, also city-owned or state parks, things like that?
Absolutely, there's a need to do it. So the National Park Service is just one player in the system of historic preservation in the United States. It has a role to coach and guide others, but in fact, we're all in this together. And whether fruit orchards are on federal land, state land, private land, they can be equally historically significant and are in need of protection as threatened cultural resources. And so there is some guidance out there for how to go about this now, and reading the Fruitful Legacy and looking at that stabilization handbook will give you a start. But you could write to me, I'll connect you with others. And through this conference series, there's a tremendous number of individuals that will help also guide you in the right direction. So absolutely important, yes.
Great. And you mentioned a couple of times the golden age of apple growing. Could you define that for us?
So the golden age of pomology is the golden age of fruit growing in the United States, and that's recognized as the 19th century. So that's the time in which most orchard varieties were originated in the United States. It became very important to culture. It became a sort of symbol of national pride, boosterism, even local regional boosterism, that regions would have their own varieties that originated there, that did better there than elsewhere. So it was an enormous source of pride. And we have not seen that kind of productivity of origination of varieties since the 19th century.
Great. The Fort Vancouver orchard, is this mostly a seedling orchard? And if not, have all of the trees been identified, and how have they been identified?
Yes, we have identified the trees. The trees were custom grown for the orchard, so we knew what the starting materials were. At the point when we started that orchard, we still had the old apple tree, the seedling apple tree that dated from the 1820s, still surviving. And our colleagues, including Joseph Postman in Corvallis, Oregon, with the National Clonal Germplasm Repository, helped us create cuttings and clone that old apple tree. So some of the reconstruction orchard is composed of the old apple tree clones. And then we raised, I should say, the Corvallis Repository raised a whole set of seedling trees for us on their own roots that were derived from Old English cider trees, cider varieties, but they were seedlings of them. And these all got planted out, but curiously, the old apple tree clones have always done far better than all the other trees. There's some innate vigor that this old tree has that has enabled it to survive all these years, and it's evident in the size of the younger trees in the reconstruction orchard.
Interesting. So we have had several questions about the cultivars that have been grown in specifically Capitol Reef, and I have linked to a list of those in the chat as well as in the answered questions in the Q&A box. So you all have access to those. But is there a similar list for all of the National Park Service orchards?
Not yet, and that's something that we're working on.
Great.
And
we'll look forward to it.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll add that to the website. So we're going to be creating a map, an interactive map with information, photographs of orchards, and we'll add the variety information as we discover it. And we have Gail Volk with us today, who's been helping us a tremendous amount DNA testing, and also Cameron Peace at Washington State University doing DNA testing of apple. We have folks in California, UC Davis. So a great number of partners are helping us now with DNA testing of varieties.
Great. And just so everybody knows, Cameron's going to be joining us on our next webinar series, or our next webinar, not the series. All right. So along the lines of cultivars, there's a lot of interest in getting access to some of the scion to graft. And this is a question for both of you, but what type of access is there to the scion wood in the park system? And specifically, we have a question about that scion being government property, and there has in the past been a reluctance to share the scion, even though the National Park Service does have some rare cultivars. Is it possible that the National Park Service is going to be willing to share material with the ARS so that these varieties can become less endangered? So it's kind of a two-part question here.
So we do have limitations on sharing material from national parks, sharing any kind of living or inanimate material from national parks. And particularly, there is a policy regarding us sharing material and it not being used for commercial purposes in the future. So we can enter into agreements with organizations that have a similar aligned mission with us for preservation and education, but and that can be done through an agreement, but it is not possible for us to share material with non-federal entities that will be used for commercial, for-profit operation objectives.
Okay, great. And let's see here, moving into some information just about growing in general. Fritz, maybe you would like to speak to this one. The question is, how does the watering requirements of a modern orchard compare to historic?
That is a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can say on a one-to-one level, on an acreage or something like that, what you would need, irrigation-wise for a modern versus a historic orchard. Susan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, you are obviously in a commercial operation growing much more intensively. You're growing more trees in a given area. So I would assume that in a way there's more water being taken up there, but the trees aren't as large. So I would assume they're somewhat comparable in terms of need, but I'm not sure. Susan, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, per acre, possibly it would be similar, Fritz, but
yeah.
Here's the thought, a dwarfing rootstock isn't as thrifty and resilient a rootstock as a seedling rootstock. Seedling trees you can leave them and some of them will survive because they are very, very large and can sort of find the water table. So a dwarfing rootstock is more of creates a tree that needs more TLC, that needs more tender loving care its whole life and can't really be abandoned or ignored. And I believe it is that the watering, it's more sensitive, less drought tolerant than a seedling rootstock. I think that can be said.
Yeah, if I might just add to the historically the flood irrigation that Fritz was describing is less efficient than modern irrigation systems like drip and micro sprinkler. And so that would be another consideration in the historic versus modern orchard and the irrigation comparison there.
Absolutely.
And I know Jude is on here from the Montezuma Orchard Research Project, and in their guide, they do mention as well that removing that flood irrigation from some historic orchards can create drought stress in the older trees because the flood irrigation tends to be deeper. Yep. And just understanding those dynamics is really important when we're talking about the care of historic orchards and their root systems. Anyways, fun facts.
I can probably give a little anecdote. So I mentioned we've been monitoring some of our irrigation, our soil moisture. So like you mentioned, it's a more efficient system to use a micro sprinkler or drip, but at the same time, you're watering much more frequently. We'll only water our orchards about every 2 weeks. And in some cases, they'll go as far as a month, even in the hottest season without water. And we've noticed that even when we haven't watered an orchard for 3 weeks and it's hovering around the 100-degree mark, that we will still see water down at the 1, 2, 3 foot level, still quite saturated. So that water does percolate quite far down through the soil table and stays around for a long time. So I think it's hard to compare the modern to the historic furrow system on a one-to-one level. There's just so many differences.
Yeah. Fritz, do you use honeybees for pollination, or is it naturally pollinated?
Yeah, good question. We don't use bees. We don't bring in any bees or anything like that. So it is. I guess I would hesitate to say it's all natural pollinators, seeing as this is an agricultural area. So we do have blue orchard bees and carpenter bees that do a lot of our pollination, but we also do have natural pollinators as well. So we don't have to do any supplemental pollination. We get really good pollination rates just with what lives in the area. All right, these orchards you can see in my background are the apricot orchards, and they're always buzzing in the springtime, which is really nice. So I encourage anybody who's in the area to come and check them out.
Yeah, it really is a special place. Again, for Fritz, what varieties of peaches are you replanting with, and are they the same as were historically grown there? Are you propagating them or working with a nursery?
Yeah. All good questions. So the peaches that we are propagating back are going to be Red Haven, Rosa, and Alberta varieties, at least for our initial plantings. So those are three, varieties that were grown here in the past. We are really interested in trying to bring back a peach called the Early Crawford. Folks may be familiar with Late Crawford, Baby Crawford. There were a number of other Crawford crosses that were crossed off that early parent, but the Early Crawford we know was grown here. It is almost completely extinct at this point. I found one grower in California and who has that. So that's something that we're trying to currently get propagated, get virus free, get propagated, and then grow out into our orchards. And I think, Katrina, there was a second part of that question as well. Oh, are we working with nurseries?
Yeah, how are you getting them propagated?
Yeah, and I guess I'll mention before I move on is just also the Lambert cherry has been tough to find, and that's one that we know was grown here. So if anybody here knows where we could find an Early Crawford peach or a Lambert cherry, I'd be interested. But we are getting our, we're not doing any propagation here. We really don't have the facilities or the expertise or the personnel to do that. But we are sending off scions or ordering from nurseries in California and then getting them shipped to us. So that's how we're currently doing that. We'll also be working with Tuli's trees down in New Mexico to do some custom grafting for us over the next couple of years. So.
Great.
I guess I'll just also, sorry to drag this out, but that is a really tough thing, is finding these historic full-size rootstocks where a lot of the commercial operations these days use primarily dwarfing. So it's been tough to find the right varieties and the right rootstocks and get them combined.
Yeah, I feel you, Fritz.
Yep.
All right, so if anybody has a favorite nursery for seedling rootstocks, I would encourage you to type it into the chat. All right, we're running low on time, so I'm gonna save it for two more questions. One is the mulch, what you use for mulch on existing or newly planted trees. And if Susan wants to chime in at all on historic mulch use, that would be an interesting addition. But go ahead, Fritz.
Sure. Yeah, we primarily use chippings from our pruned wood. So wood chips is our primary mulch that we use. It's something that we're kind of experimenting with, trying to get enough of it and trying to use it, trying to see if that it actually helps or not with weed suppression and with moisture retention. So that's something that we've got to dive into. But Susan, do you have any thoughts on the greater?
So mulching, I think, is more of a later day concept, but historically cured manure was spread within the tree line, the drip line of the canopy, as a sort of mulch, but also as a sort of fertilization treatment. But historically, weeds and pests were kept out of the orchard by allowing chickens and other livestock to graze under the trees. And all of these trees probably received a lot more frequent TLC than we have the capacity to give them today. And so they weren't mulched, but they were more weeded or fertilized, manured more often than we give them. So manure in a way is a little bit of a shortcut for us, but it also makes great sense for resilience and sustainability. And so we've embraced it.
Great. So our last question is from Nancy Webb, who sent me a great photo of rootstock and scion growing together, interwoven. And I'll see if I can get it up on my share screen before everybody leaves. But in the meantime, she also asked, what is essential to a successful application for National Historical Registry status for groups of trees in and out of national parks?
All right. So and almost any place, any property can be eligible for the National Register if it has two very important things. And one is significance in history, and the other one is integrity, meaning that it still appears similar today to what it did in the period for which it is significant. So it has authenticity, if you like. It hasn't been transformed a great deal. So it has significance or importance, and it has integrity or authenticity. It has to have those things. And this significance can be at the national level, can be at the state level, or it can be at the local level. So even something that's locally significant to your place on Earth can be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It doesn't have to be of nationwide significance, but something that was important in patterns of history, nationally, state, locally. And it still is representative today of the thing that it was in the period for which it is significant. So take a look at Fruitful Legacy to give you some guidance about that. There's one chapter in there about registering fruit trees on the National Register.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. I know you both might have, or folks might have a few more questions. And so Fritz and Susan have graciously provided their contact information. Feel free to follow up with them. And thank you again for joining us today. And let's see, here is the photo of Nancy's tree on San Juan Island. Let me see here why. Oh, wow. There we go. And the one on the left is the rootstock, and the one on the right is the pear, which now I have to go back to her notes to remember if it's Anjou or Bosc. Hold on one second. But great, thank you everybody for joining us today, and we will hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next month on March 16th for a webinar with, let's see, we have Cameron Peace and Jude Schwenemeyer, and that will be moderated by Richard Ullman of the Lost Apple Project. It's going to be about registry and mapping and cataloging your trees. So should be a great one. Thanks everyone for tuning in for today, and we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Susan.
So much.
Fritz.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.